Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to take your seats, and let's start. The time is wasting, and this is going to be, I think, an excellent panel. They all are, but this one is particularly interesting because it deals with the subject that, as one of the people who are here commenting said, there's not enough about Russia that we've heard so far. So right now we're going to get our fill of a lot of Russian issues, and I'm glad it's a good turnout, and as I said, an excellent panel. I'm going to introduce them in a second. Obviously, you have in your books and pamphlets their backgrounds, and they are all esteemed experts and officials from various facilities and organizations and governments. But I just want to kind of set the idea of what we're trying to do in the next hour and a half. And we'll break it into about 45 minutes of discussion and then go to questions. So I know there will be a lot of questions. But, you know, the subject, as I looked at it, be careful what you wish for, is Russia trumped. And I was just thinking of the past few weeks, let alone months, where you had these really kind of head-spinning events that begin to make you wonder what Vladimir Putin must be wondering in the Kremlin. Where are we going with this? Because you start, let's say, before the election and certainly during early Trump, there was cautious optimism in the Kremlin, I would say. The media were more ostentatious, but cautious hope that something would happen because of Donald Trump's election, and perhaps there would be something that they could work on. I think cautious is really underscored. I don't think that they were at all ecstatic or hoping that major things would change. But you had, you know, the issue of sanctions in Syria and cooperation in general. Then you have, probably Vladimir Putin's horror, a lot of missteps in the early part of the administration. And they look even at American domestic policies in the Kremlin and looking at healthcare and other things that the president, the migration ban, et cetera, or things like that, looking at those and saying, where is the administration headed? And then you also had the unpredictable lack of policy that we still, to a certain extent, have. I think it's becoming clearer. But there has been quite a bit of confusion leading to this question of whether, Russia put its eggs in a basket and is disappointed. And these are the experts who are going to try to answer these questions. So going down the line here, Dmitry Suslov is from the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies, and also with the Valdai Discussion Club, which I know quite well, which meets in Moscow, and I think we have a valuable perspective from Dmitry. Then we have Thomas Graham from Yale University and also Kissinger Associates. Then Stefan Meister, who is from the German Council on Foreign Relations. And last but not least, Tony Gardner, who's the former US ambassador to the EU. So let me begin with that first question. And Zima, I think we're going to start with you on this. Is Russia trumped?
No.
Well, that was easy. Okay. Why?
First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a great honor and privilege to speak in this distinguished audience and with the distinguished panel. I think, Jill, you are absolutely right in your introductory remarks to say that Russian approach towards Trump administration was quite cautious from the very beginning. And no one was seriously thinking about big deal. I think a big deal between Russia and the United States now is excluded. Under any administration, including Trump's administration, we would never agree on the terms of this deal. We would never deliver or want to deliver the price on the basis of which this big deal could be. So maximum what could happen is a very limited and cautious escape from the new Cold War that we've been in since 2014, and practical, pragmatic cooperation based on small steps. And I think we're still there. Moreover, there were many features of the Trump's administration foreign policy approach that Russia was pretty much concerned about from the very beginning. They were, for instance, philosophical unilateralism, propensity to increase substantially defense spending, propensity to violate international law and disregard multilateral institutions when the administration finds it prudent in the near-term future. The certain understanding that exists in the Republican establishment that the relative decline of the United States over the past several years was rather a result of Obama's weakness, but not of historic trends in the world and the world moving towards greater polycentricism, the propensity to bully partners and both allies and not allies and start your dialogue with bullying. And all those features proved right over the last 3 months. And of course, due to the domestic turmoil in the United States and the instrumentalization of Russia as an instrument of undermining and torpedoing Trump, and a partial mainstreamization and normalization of the US foreign policy, Russia's expectations about the prospects of relations with the Trump administration, which were cautious and limited from the very beginning, become even more cautious. They diminished to a certain extent. Yes, indeed, from the very beginning, Russia, for instance, expected that it would be easier for the Trump administration to exert pressure on Ukraine and compel Kyiv to implement its part of the Minsk agreements. Now, because of the domestic situation in the United States, it's utterly impossible. And I do not regard Ukraine at all as an area where we can achieve some results, some positive results with the United States, with the Trump administration in the near-term future. There was an expectation that America First approach would allow Trump administration to rethink its policies in Europe and to lead towards a relative de-escalation and reduction of tensions in Russia-NATO relations in both Baltic Sea region, Black Sea region, deployments of the NATO infrastructure in Romania, Poland, and the Baltic states, and so on and so forth. Now it's not possible. It's not possible. But having said of that, it does not mean that Russia is trumped, and it does not mean that there is no opportunity whatsoever to achieve some normalization in US-Russia relations, which I do not define as friendly relations. US-Russia relations will not become friendly or partner-based in the observable future. What I mean by normalization is moving towards new Cold War, from systemic confrontation that we're having now, to a mixed relationship, very unstable and very mixed relationship, where we have cooperation and competition at the same time. And the chances for this still exist. Why? Because of 4 reasons that I have. And there are several features in the Trump administration that Moscow is still quite optimistic and, I would say, happy about. First, one of the most central and consistent features of the Trump's administration approach to foreign policy is de-ideologization. It's rejection of regime change. It's less emphasis on the promotion of democracy and human rights. It's interest-based policy, and so on and so forth. They do not want neocons in the administration. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why the administration is still half empty. They do not want regime change in Russia, in Syria, whatsoever. Even the Trump's administration rhetoric after the chemical weapons episode that Russia needs to think about replacing Assad, we understand it, and I would even say we know it very well. It's not about regime change. It's about Trump looking great and looking stronger than Obama, and it is about Trump getting some symbolic foreign policy victory, not really about regime change in Syria. Look, Rex Tillerson was absolutely clear and persistent on this de-ideologization of the US foreign policy, and that policies and values are different things in his recent program address in the State Department. And this is the kind of the United States that Russia can interact with, because Russia is much more concerned about a revisionist America and ideological America than a strong America, and even then a bullying America. Secondly, the Trump administration doesn't want to increase support of Ukraine and increase the kind of confrontation that we're having in Central and Eastern Europe. Yes, his hands are absolutely tied in terms of decreasing this, in terms of reducing the support for Ukraine, or in terms of pressuring Kiev more. But at the same time, it is absolutely clear that he doesn't want to aggravate things, that he doesn't want, for instance, to supply lethal weapons to Ukraine. He doesn't want even to talk about providing Ukraine with the out of NATO alliance status, and he doesn't want to accelerate the containment of Russia in other parts of the former Soviet Union, be it the Caucasus or Central Asia. We do not see any kind of intention on or any kind of steps on the part of the Trump administration that could result in the increase of their involvement in these other regions of the post-Soviet space. And finally, there is, I think, a full understanding in both Moscow and Washington that the preservation of status quo is very dangerous, and that we need to make sure that first we do not lose control over the confrontational relations that we're having now, and secondly, that we should try to move forward using step-by-step approach to get out of this confrontation. There is a full well, in Moscow there is an interest, a sincere interest in improving the relations with the United States, because in Russia's perception, for Russia to consolidate its position in the multipolar world as an independent global player, we need to have balanced relations with other great powers, including the United States. And on the Trump administration, I think there is still an understanding that China, not Russia, is the strategic rival and strategic risk for the United States in the medium and longer term prospect, and that they can't contain Russia and China at the same time. Yes, the domestic turmoil in the United States, plus a partial normalization of the US foreign policy, made implementation of this thinking more difficult in the near-term future, but this is still the strategic orientation, and this necessitates the Trump administration to improve the relations with Russia. So I think small steps approach is the right policy. And I think this small steps approach should be based on the following criteria. Namely, we need to cooperate not for the sake of cooperation, but where this is demanded by our national interests. Secondly, we should cooperate where this cooperation does not demand in advance clear concessions on either of the sides. Three, it's better to proceed in a minilateral way, minilateral cooperation rather than clear bilateral cooperation, and this is, by the way, the demand of the objective trends in the international relations. So what kind of agenda do I see thus in the near and medium-term future?
Dmitry,
I will just enumerate it, and it will be just...
Why don't we do this? Hold that thought, because I'm sure we'll get back to it. I just want to move on to, because I really want to get a lot packed in. You packed an awful lot into what you just said. I don't even know where to begin. But I will begin with a small thing. With Thomas, you know, when there's a perception in the United States that Russia, I mean, this is so simplistic, but, you know, Russia wanted Trump. Or at least you could say Russia didn't want Hillary Clinton, and they wanted Trump eventually. Do you think that they wanted him? And, I mean, really wanted him? And what about this grand bargain? Was there ever in your imagination the possibility that there would be a grand bargain between the United States and Russia as we entered the Trump era?
Yeah, let me start with the first question, and also it is a real pleasure to be here. this distinguished panel. It's an important issue. You know, I think it's clear that the Russians were quite concerned about Hillary Clinton, her record on Russia policy. They saw a hawk. They thought she would be harder than the Obama administration had been. So there's certainly no love lost between the Kremlin and Secretary Clinton during the campaign. And they did everything that they possibly could to undermine Clinton during that campaign. But I think they were as surprised as everyone else was on November 8th when Trump won. They had really, I think, been setting it up to leak out some information, complicate matters for Secretary Clinton, and hold the really good stuff until after November 8th when they had to deal with the incoming administration. On November 8th, they had to switch gears. I think there was a great deal of concern about who Trump was. He had been contradictory during the campaign, some things that were positive about Russia, other things, as Dmitry pointed out, military modernization, breaking up the Iran deal, that really ran counter to Russian interests, and also unpredictable. As many people have noted, the Kremlin thought that Putin's unpredictability was a great asset, and dealing with an American leader who was unpredictable was going to be a real challenge. So I don't, as Dmitry said, I think they were very cautious about Trump. If you listen to what the Kremlin was saying, and not so much what the Russian media was saying, they always said, we're cautiously optimistic, we don't want to exaggerate, this is a difficult relationship, there are a lot of deep problems, there's no quick fix to this, we're prepared to deal with the Trump administration, we'll see what's on offer. I don't think there was ever any hope that there would be a grand bargain in Moscow. I don't think any desire to have a grand bargain in the United States, or even on the part of Trump personally. Now, what Dmitry is describing, I would say, as a desired outcome, is really what I would call a return to the norm in U.S.-Russian relations. If you think about the history of this relationship from the time the United States emerged as a major power at the end of the 19th century, it's never been particularly close. It's generally been a competitive relationship. We've had 3 very brief periods of cooperation, if that's what you'd like to call it. After the United States entered the First World War, and we had a February Revolution in Russia, and the United States thought that we could partner with Russia in making the world safe for democracy. Well, that died in October with another revolution. After the end of the Cold War, a somewhat longer period, when we thought Russia was in an inevitable transition to a democracy and a free market economy, this fit in with our worldview. We were going to partner with Russia. That certainly died with the Ukraine crisis. I think if you look back to Putin's speech in Munich in 2007, that was an indication of where things were headed. But beyond that, I actually think the Russians made a decision to move in a different direction after the Orange Revolution in Kiev in Ukraine in 2004. And then finally, we have the one the Russians talk about all the time during the Second World War against Nazi Germany, an existential threat to both countries. But it was a period of cooperation that was laced with deep suspicion. We actually fought more in parallel than we did together. And so this is a relationship that historically has been one where we've engaged in political competition. We have advocated different concepts of world order, and we have espoused different values. And that's the situation today. And that means we're going to have a largely competitive relationship going forward, perhaps with elements of cooperation. And the other point I would make here is that this is not a consequence simply of Putin. It really is a consequence of the overall state of relations between our two countries. It's a persistent challenge for the United States, managing this relationship in a way that advances American interests. So no grand bargain for that reason, but we do have to deal with each other. These are two countries that have been, for the past 100 and so years, essential pillars of world order. We bump into each other around the globe, certainly in Eurasia writ large, but on a range of functional issues as well. And so what you're going to see the Trump administration do is re-engage, That's Lavrov's meeting at the White House earlier this week. No attempt to isolate Russia, but I think a very slow process towards developing what that agenda is going to be. We'll get, I think, more clarification if the two presidents have a substantive meeting on the margins of the G20. The Russians clearly want that. I think the Trump administration has been a bit more coy about whether that's going to take place and in what capacity. But whatever the agenda is, I think it's going to be what Tillerson said to the State Department just a short time ago. It's going to be a lot of small things and perhaps one big thing.
Okay, so we're back to that idea. 2 out of 4 so far have said no grand bargain, nobody ever expected it. But you could also look at it as, you know, great expectations or just expectations. So Stefan, obviously I'm presuming you're going to say no, there were no great expectations, but there must have been some expectations that Russia had about the relationship. I mean, could you give us an idea, in your view, what Russia hoped for at the beginning of this administration and where it sees itself now in terms of those expectations?
Mm-hmm. Also, thank you from my side having me here. Thanks to Yuri and his team for setting this great conference here up. I really enjoy it very much. Let me also make some points, and I will also answer your questions. I think maybe let's start like this. I think Russia had no expectations because it didn't expect that Trump will win the election. So then there was a bit euphoria that this guy who was promoted in Russian propaganda as our guy won the election. But then what comes after this? And I think it became very, very clear that Trump had also no idea about Russia. He had no plan for Russia. And he had no idea also how to engage with Russia and what Russia is about. Yeah, so I think Dima made the main points in saying that main point is there's no democratization agenda. There's no interference in our sphere of influence, and this guy will accept Russia like it is. So I think that's the maximum you get. Yeah, so I think that's his, and I would agree. I think this is the perspective. I want to add. I think for me the question is not if Trump is. No, I think the main question is Trump is Putin, not Putin is Trumped. Yeah, I think we observe a kind of a Putinization also of the US in some areas, and. Just to make some points, yeah, as also the other speakers have made, I think what have both in common, Putin and Trump? I think they both mistrust liberal values. They both reject norms and institutions created after World War II and brought a lot of stability and welfare. They both are great in deconstructing the existing order, but have no idea how to fix it or to build a new one. So is this enough to start a new reset? I don't think so. Yeah, so I think both are deal makers, but deals need some common interests and needs at least some trust, which does not exist in my opinion. Are there common interests, and what could serve for deals? I think I completely agree. I have my doubts. Yeah, if we look more concrete, Russian leadership is not fighting IS, but only those groups who fight against Assad. It has neither the capacity nor the interest nor the resources to fight ISIS really seriously. I think Putin will never support Trump against China, which would be another topic of cooperation. Even worse, China might be a country with whom it is much more attractive to Trump to make a deal than with Russia, especially against the background of the trade turnover they both have. Even if Russian leadership offers to Trump a carrot, like, for instance, deals with ExxonMobil, this is nothing which brings substantial economic benefits to the US economy. So I don't see really what can Russia offer. Yeah, I think the main problem is that the Kremlin has not so much to offer. Neither has Trump a plan for Russia, nor will he be willing to pay a high price with the Congress to improve relations with Putin. I think in the opposite. He even does not understand what is New START or INF treaty about it, I think, which limits also Russia's bargaining position towards the US, how to threaten a US president who does not understand the threat. Yeah, I think that might be a bit problem if you want to make a good deal. While Russian leadership is passionate in all its international actions to get recognized by the US president to come on the same eye level, Trump does not care about much about Russia. So, where to cooperate? Again, I would ask, where cooperation would be possible. I think it could be Afghanistan. Russian leadership is threatened by the collapse of the current Afghan leadership and spillover effects to Central Asia and Russia itself. But it supports at the same time the Taliban, it plays its own games in the country, and it is no credible partner there. So it could be Syria, where the Russian adventure has become more dangerous, more expensive, and longer than expected. But it sticks too much to Assad, whom Moscow in the end does not really control. It depends also on Iran's support, who is playing its own games. Yeah, and has to deal with Donald Trump, who has no plan for Syria again, and might use it for power projection, but not for compromise and cooperation. So again, что делать, yeah? What to do? I think it brings always back to the same point. Russian leadership is not using, in my opinion, also from a European perspective, it's not using the opportunity that we sitting in the same boat as Europeans and the Russians with regard to the unpredictable Donald Trump, and try a policy of engagement and rapprochement with at least some confidence-building measures towards the European Union. It's just using the moment. As Putin's meeting with Angela Merkel recently has shown, he moves no millimeter on Ukraine, no millimeter on disinformation, and no millimeter on European security. I think that's a missed opportunity, and he thinks he gets a better deal. Yeah, I think Russian leadership seems to have the impression that it is on the winning side, even if it alienates its partners. So I don't see a chance for a reset. I think Putin has the impression that this bargaining position will improve anyway, but I think that's wrong. We all have to pay the costs by further undermining European security by Russian leadership, destabilizing and alienating Ukraine, no substantial growth in EU-Russia trade, no trust building in Western Russian relations, but further arms race linked to a lack of functioning multilateral institutions. I think that's a dangerous situation we are. An unstable Middle East with all the known effects for Europe, where all the actors are playing their games but are not willing to stop the war. So I don't see the basis for engagement and cooperation at the moment. I think the level of mistrust, mutual misunderstanding, and alienation has reached a level which makes any cooperation agreement difficult. So, but I agree with Dima that small steps are the only thing which are possible. And I think we need new institutional and communication arrangement to manage the situation. And I think that's the maximum we get at the moment.
Okay, so you're a pessimist, basically, Stefan.
I'm a realist.
Okay, a realist. Tony, I want to turn to you because that I think the European part of this obviously is very important, especially because during the campaign and for quite a while, many in the West have said that the ultimate aim of Russia is to separate, drive the United States and Europe apart. You were the US representative to the EU. Where do we stand in terms of that? Do you agree with that? Is that one of the major aims of Russia? And where do we stand now in the beginning of the Trump administration, specifically on that issue of the unity between Europe and the United States?
Well, yes, we did terrific work together, not just over the last 3 years, but for decades. The United States and the European Union, or Europe more broadly, on many of these issues. So it would be on the agenda of furthering anti-corruption. It would be on stabilizing the Balkans. More recently, it was putting together a package of sanctions against Russia for its invasion and annexation of part of Ukraine. And together we supported more broadly, and here I want to pick up a point that Stefan made, we supported the system that we built up together, the multilateral, rules-based, liberal international economic order we built together after the Second World War. These two leaders share something, and that is a disdain for this order, because both believe that that order has undermined the interests of their countries. It's quite remarkable. In this way, Trump is a revolutionary leader. He thinks that we've been somehow undermined by this system. And that offers a huge number of opportunities for Putin. A vacuum in the Balkans. Of course, the EU has been very active there, thankfully, continues to be so. But we may start to ignore the Balkans. We will offer enormous opportunities if we start to de-emphasize the anti-corruption policies that we were, because of dirty money that the Russians are very adept at using and buying influence throughout the world and throughout Europe. If we do not follow through on the policy of making sure that Ukraine emerges as a stable, democratic, prosperous European country, then the opportunities for Russia will also increase. And I'm not mentioning many other things like Syria and Libya in other words. So there's a smorgasbord of opportunities before Putin right now. And I think I agree, there's no grand bargain. All we need to do right now is to do what we did in the past, even during the Cold War, is to make progress where progress is possible. And I am very skeptical there are many areas of progress, but we haven't mentioned any of them, but I think the Arctic might be one of them. I think combating nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism might be one of them. It would be combating Islamic fundamentalism online. And it would be to try to ensure that the efforts that we made on strategic arms control don't completely fall apart either. There are a number of areas, and also confidence building measures, extremely important, because there's a real risk of us stumbling into a conflict if we don't actually fix the rules or make sure the rules stick. So there's obviously the areas we could work on together, but I'm troubled that, Stefan, your point, these leaders do share something fundamental, and it offers Putin enormous opportunities.
You know, before we go to questions, we have a little bit of time. I just want to see if we can more quickly go down the line of the panel and talk about something that we began to talk about here at the podium, which is, in any bargain, and we're not talking about a grand bargain anymore because all of you have vetoed that idea, but in any agreement or way of cooperating, people give something, people take something, and sometimes it's being depicted as what can Russia give, or often what can the United States give to have a better relationship with Russia. Maybe that dynamic or that approach is wrong, but I would like to get each gentleman to, you know, weigh in on, I guess I would phrase it as, Putin knows what he wants because he's been in power for, what, almost 17 years. Mr. Trump is new. I don't think he's defined what he wants, really, as a strategy. But what do each want out of this relationship? Yes, please.
Well, there are some small, tiny things that Russia could actually give to the Trump administration and present them as Trump's huge victories in the international affairs.
Let me write these down.
Flights without transponders in the Baltic Sea region. I mean, banning them, right, and agreeing that no longer Russia will do this. Accelerating Russia's bombings of ISIS in Syria, and so on. But I think that we should proceed in managing these relations not in terms of give and take approach. I completely agree with Stefan that there is quite little that Russia could deliver to the United States, even the Trump administration, and vice versa, because our objective interests are so different. Not necessarily clashing everywhere, but just different. And because we are promoting different understandings of international order, and the nature of our conflict is systemic, not occasional. I completely agree with Tom Graham on this. Actually, the roots of the current state of relations between Russia and the United States go back to 1991 and 1992, because it is back then when our fundamental disagreements on the end of the Cold War and the idea of what kind of post-Cold War international order should follow started. So it's not give and take. It's two things. First, it is damage limitation, or keeping control over the unfriendly, conflictual and confrontational relationships. And this includes, indeed, arms control. Yes, Trump may not know what New START agreement and INF is, but I don't think that we can't cooperate there. The initial skeptical stance of Trump on these things we interpret as a typical Trumpism, that he starts negotiations by bullying the partner, by bullying the opponent, and then gets into these negotiations from the position of strength. So we don't dramatize that at all. The United States is not interested in the destruction of INF, and the United States is not interested in the destruction of New START. So we should proceed there. Confidence-building measures, both bilateral and multilateral. Multilateral, I mean NATO-Russia Council and OSCE. This is something a must in US-Russia relations in the observable future. Cybersecurity, agreeing on the channels of communications, red lines, understandings of what is allowed, what is not allowed, right? It is of utmost importance. So this is one side of the agenda of US-Russia relations for the observable future. The second one is, again, not about give and take, but we are compelled to meeting each other on many issues and in many places in the world. And this includes Eurasia, this includes Middle East, this includes Asia Pacific, this includes Europe. And there are ways of cooperating there. I'm quite cautiously optimistic about US-Russian cooperation in Syria, because Trump administration is not, again, ideological. It is not starting with demanding regime change in Syria. It is not about regime change at all. And yes, of course, there are limitations, namely the role of Iran in the future Syrian interplay, but I think it is a manageable thing for the US and Russia. And in the meantime, we can cooperate on very many issues. Intensified meal-to-meal contacts, management of these 4 zones of escalation, and the United States is interested in them. Greater cooperation on the political resolution process. And ultimately, Assad, of course, will go. Of course will go. And I think those people who think that Russia is fully committed to Trump, to Assad, and wants to keep Assad, they don't understand the essence of Russian foreign policy. You know, remember the very first phrase that Boris Yeltsin said in 1999 when NATO started its campaign against Yugoslavia. He didn't say that NATO violated international law, UN Charter, and so on. He said we were not consulted with. So what Russia is serious about in Syria, it is not Assad. Well, it is first preservation of the Syrian state. And secondly, that the transition in Syria, which of course will result to a different president in this country, is not imposed unilaterally by the United States, but it is managed together with the full-fledged participation of Russia as a multilateral process, right, which will result with in a new Syria. Afghanistan, I think we can and should cooperate there. Someone mentioned that Russia has links and supports Taliban in Afghanistan. It's quite bizarre for me to hear that, because isn't it the United States who tried to establish ties with Taliban under the Obama administration? Right? I mean, and they tried, they had a series of conversations in Doha and so on and so forth. And I think it is a matter of reality, just an issue of reality, that you cannot preserve Afghanistan in a more or less manageable state without Taliban, because it is indestructible. Or the destruction of will require so much military involvement that neither the United States, nor NATO, nor China, nor of course Russia would be eager to deliver. Pakistan factor, and so on and so
Dmitry,
forth. So
yes, okay, we've got, I think, a lot there, but I do really want to move. No, thank you. I mean, this is all fantastic, but I do think we have to move to some other people and how they view this. Thomas, you're up.
Yeah, very quickly on this. I had a conversation once with a Russian diplomat about sort of the nature of this relationship, what the exchanges could be, and so forth. we had a little discussion about a grand bargain. But the question is, if we were to meet you halfway on Syria, if we were engaged in some negotiations over Ukraine, what is that Russia was prepared to give to the United States? And his response was, we could promise not to make life difficult for you everywhere else in the world. And that's, again, one of the problems in the relationship. I think the starting point here is quite simple. It's U.S. national interest. We need to define quite clearly what we want to do in the world, what's vital to us, and how we want to go about doing that. I think something that previous administrations have done, this administration, in 4 short months, has only begun to do in a serious way. So we're somewhere down the road. Once you can define what the interests are, then the next logical question is, Russia a possible partner or rival on that issue? And the third is, actually, how important is Russia? Do we really need to get Russia on board to get this done or not? And here, I think, we're going to have a large difference with Russia, where Russia likes to believe that it's a great power, wants to deal with the United States on a full range of global issues. But quite frankly, on a lot of these, Russia is a secondary or tertiary partner. Certainly as you get out into the big questions in East Asia. Where do we have to deal with the Russians? Things that Dima has already mentioned: strategic stability, arms control types of issues. Cyber is a big issue where there is a crying need now for the United States to sit down with Russia to see if we can work out some sort of rules of the road, some common understanding of how we are going to deal with this nascent domain that has become much more an element of both our economic prosperity and our security. Then the final point on this is, again, I think the Russians would like to believe that the U.S.-Russian relationship is going to be critical in all of these, certainly the way they're looking at Syria. But it does have to be not so much in a multilateral framework, but we need to realize that the United States and Russia don't determine the outcomes anymore. This is not the Cold War. Quite frankly, our influence, Russian influence, is dramatically less. You can't solve the Middle East without Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel being involved, and then also all those people on the ground. And the same thing goes for any other problem. So I think the Russians' real sort of problem going forward is getting a firmer grasp or coming to grips with what their real role in the world is going to be, the role they can play, and how important they are in a constructive way to dealing with a lot of the global problems that are on the agenda of the United States, our allies in Europe, and in East Asia.
Mm-hmm. Stefan, that's a really very interesting point, because it's very sensitive for Russia. After all, it thinks that it is a very important and influential country and wants to have a place at the table. Thomas is raising the issue that maybe it's not as important. What do you think? I mean, let's go back to the Trump administration as they put together their foreign policy. How important in the ranking of countries and roles should Russia be?
Well, I think it's true. Russia is not really important to the US in terms of the economy, in terms of also look to the military balance and the military differences. US is in many sense a global power, and which Russia is not. Yeah, Russia is a nuclear power. I think this makes it a great power. But if you look to the economy, it has the GDP size of Spain. So I think it's a middle-sized European power. Yeah. So I think the problem is we cannot ignore Russia. Yeah, I think this is what Obama tried. He tried in many sense to ignore Russia, and Russia can mess a lot. Yeah, Putin can remind himself in different ways that he plays a role. But I think what he's not able and where he's lacking the resources is to solve problems. Yeah, I think he has neither the mindset, nor the ability, nor the resources to be really a power or a player who solves the Syrian conflict, who solves the Afghan conflict. So he's using these conflicts to get attention, He's using these conflicts, yeah, to come on the same eye level with the US president. I think that's the main goal of Putin, so how to come on the same eye level. But he's always destructive. Yeah, it's about win and lose for Putin. There is no win-win, and in the end, he gets mostly lose-lose. So I think, I think that's a bit, that's for me a little bit a problem. But I agree with the colleagues. I think the main goal has to be to manage the relations at the moment, to find a modus where there is a kind of agreement, where there are kind of red lines, where there are institutions, where there is communication, where there are meetings between the leaders. And I think that's what we get out of it.
Tony, what do you think is absolutely crucial for the United States to work with Russia on right now?
Well, I agree with a lot of what my fellow panelists have said. The question is absolutely not what we should be offering Russia. That's not the right question. The question is what are our interests and the interests of our allies, and how do we promote them? And the second important thing is that we treat Russia as it is and not treat Russia as we hoped it would be. Those are two very different things. And if we treat Russia as it is, I think the scope for cooperation is extremely limited. And we need to be very patient, something in the United States, at least, we're not very good at. We need to take the long view, because one of the main winning cards, I think, of Russia has always been the ability to take a longer view and to be opaque and to be unpredictable. Again, something that we haven't been very good at. So I think the agenda is to defend our interests, and I have a few things on my list. Defend our interests and make sure that Russia does not play the spoilers game so effectively, and they have an opportunity to play the spoilers game. First, we need to do a much better job at combating disinformation. We're doing some good work with Stratcom. I was involved in some of it, but we should be thinking in magnitudes larger. You know, just RT in the United States is spending over $400 million. Stratcom should have a budget that's 10 times larger. We are losing this game. The second is that we should make absolutely sure that we ensure that NATO remains the bedrock of our alliance and that Article 5 is inviolable. We should not be using language that somehow undermines that concept. The third, we should absolutely not be taking our eye off of the important issue of European energy security, because that is one of the key areas that Russia has been so good at in terms of undermining or magnifying European energy dependence. And the fourth I mentioned before, it's absolutely fundamental. It is essential that Ukraine become a viable, democratic, prosperous state. If we fail in that regard, then we will have failed in many other ways. There is no better way to affect the long-term trajectory of Russia's long-term future than to make sure that there is a model on Russia's frontier of a democratic, prosperous state for the Russian people to see. So that's the way I would look at the picture, rather than to see what can we be offering to Russia.
Okay, so let's go to questions. Do we have the microphones? If you can start with the gentleman right here.
Thank you.
Oh, Georg, yeah.
Yes, thank you. My name is Georgi Kandelaki. I'm an MP from Georgia, European Georgia Party, parliamentary opposition. When we mention Ukraine, let's not forget Georgia and Moldova, because before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was obviously Russian invasion of Georgia. And I want to thank Mr. Suslov for so clearly formulating what Russia's strategic objective really is. He said that the fundamentals of the disagreement go back to the end of the Cold War. And indeed, Russia's objective is to reverse the results of the Cold War to the extent possible. And not seeing that would be worse than a crime, just a mistake.
Let's start with the question. Was that a question?
That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. And could we have the microphone over here, please?
Mark Fisher for G+. One short challenge to what Mr. Meister said. I think we are always very quick in calming ourselves, saying like, well, Russia has an economy the size of Spain and is not a global power. I would have to say yes, if you compare the Russian military with the US military, obviously it does not have the same reach other than the nuclear factor. But the final difference is that Russia has been showing a clear willingness to use that military and to use it for very clearly defined and very quite quickly well, for goals that it seems to have reached to a certain degree at least. So we shouldn't underestimate that. I'm not promoting that, but we shouldn't underestimate this. The other question is on RT, on public diplomacy, on owning the news sphere. Exactly. Why isn't the West doing more and using its much larger resources to dominate the debate? Our news stations are much, much larger, but apparently we're not using them as eloquently as the Russians are using them for their political ends. And I'm wondering just, some people have worked in government here, is that just a blind spot that we have, or is it something that we're not willing to do? Or is that, I don't know, or is it just a lack of our means?
Yeah. Tony, I think that's a good question for you, especially the second one. I don't know that I'd use the word eloquently for Russian media, but how would you answer this question about why isn't the West doing something?
I think part of it is, we've been limited in our funding, whether it's through Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. We haven't yet stepped up or willingness to fund, but it's not just a question of money. I think we're just also too timid. I think we're too timid. I saw it on TTIP as well. I lived through that during 3 years. It's not just the standard media, the television and the print, it's the social media sphere. And I think we haven't been willing to innovate enough in terms of how we articulate our values and objectives, whether it's in trade agreements or otherwise. So part of it, I think, is funding, and part of it, I think, is that we've simply been too timid.
Okay. Anders, I think we have a question from Anders.
Anders Åslund from the Atlantic Council. To my surprise, I find the panel a bit too downbeat. So I wonder, isn't there something that could be done on Ukraine? Dmitry, wouldn't be good for Russia to get rid of this lousy occupied Donbass? And Tom, you mentioned that you thought that Tillerson had thinking of one big thing, but as far as I heard, you didn't try to. Wouldn't Ukraine be a good thing to do?
Oh, well, who wants to? Dmitry, do you want to begin with
Thank
that?
you for this question.
It's the first optimistic one that we've had.
If it were about Donbass, then it would be absolutely easy, but unfortunately it's not. It's about fundamental rules of great power relationship. And according to the Russian understanding of these rules, the political status quo in Ukraine and international political status quo in Ukraine and around Ukraine can be sustainable only if Russia agrees with that status quo. And this is what Russia is fighting for. And I see no absolutely incentive for Russia to reverse its policy. The fight is about status quo. I mean, the status quo that emerged in Ukraine in 2014 with the support of the West and the Obama administration is unacceptable for Russia, right? I mean, the way as it created and the substance of the status quo is unacceptable. So this is why is Russia really fighting and was fighting for this formula in the Minsk agreements, which is the Ukrainian control of Donbass in exchange for constitutional reform, because constitutional reform, as Russia interprets that, is the change of the status quo and recognition of the Russia's role in establishing of the new status quo in Ukraine. Clearly, this formula is not working, and I don't think that Minsk agreements are implementable, despite of the positive wishes. I would love them to see implemented, but unfortunately, it's not in the observable future. So I think we are doomed for a continuation of this negative status quo. And if you ask me what is my interpretation of the Plan B in for Russia's understanding of Plan B, then the Plan B is further deterioration of economic and political situation in Ukraine. The new Maidan, not against a pro-Russian Yanukovych, but against a pro-Western Poroshenko. A complete chaos in this country that comes from a combination of political security and economic factors. And this deterioration, in the Russian opinion, would compel the West to start a dialogue with Russia about the future of what we define as common neighborhood, right? And understand this word, common neighborhood means that the fate and the status quo in this neighborhood needs to be common and defined in a common way, not just imposed by one of the sides.
Dima, I'm wondering whether that's a hope or a fear, but in any case.
It's a real, I would say.
Thomas?
Can I jump on this?
Yes, please.
Because I think there may be, I take your point, Andrew. I mean, this may be something where the big thing that you can do, not right away, over time. Russia has been consistently wrong about what's going to happen in countries along its borders, about collapse and so forth. It never quite turned out the way they anticipated, certainly not over the long run and not in the short run. I also think we need to take into account, and Dima may disagree with this, other people would, I think Russia's overstretched. We tend to focus on the success of Russian foreign policy. The Kremlin certainly focuses on the success of Russian foreign policy. But if you're thinking about what Russia's security challenges are over the long term, Putin's successes are going to come back to bite Russia. The Syrian incursion has already lasted much longer than the Kremlin had suggested at the beginning of it. There's no exit from that in sight. And maybe the Russians are getting something out of training under real combat conditions, but that's still a drain on a budget and on an economy that's not really growing as rapidly as it needs to at this point. Substantial forces are tied down dealing with the Ukraine crisis. They've got to think about NATO. They see it as a threat. So Putin's actions in Ukraine, the provocative strategic reconnaissance in and around NATO, have created another challenge. The Arctic is opening up. You've got to defend that border for the first time in history. Central Asia, Afghanistan is unstable, another drain on your resources. And no matter what you say about strategic partnership with the Chinese, it's 1.4 billion people, 8 times your economy, it's growing, and you have a history of historical grievances. So I think Putin is actually in need to come to some sort of deal with the West and with the United States in particular. That's why they've been so active in pushing the normalization of the relationship. They have been, I think, disappointed at how unexcited the Trump administration has appeared about engaging Russia. Someone mentioned this morning, think of all the leaders that have come to either the White House, Mar-a-Lago, over the past 3 months, and we still don't know whether there's going to be a first meeting between Trump and Putin, whether it's really going to be a substantive meeting at all. So I think there's a need in Russia not to wait out in Ukraine, but to try to come to some sort of resolution of this. And so the question, I think, for us is how might we do that? I don't think Minsk agreements in its present context or form is implementable. But that doesn't mean that we can't sort of break that agreement apart and decide whether there's certain things that we need that require concrete steps on the Russian side that I think we ought to look at in the context of our sanctions regime. There may be other things we can do with Ukraine. I think thinking about where Ukraine is going to be, sort of the NATO expansion issue, whether there's some way through practical statements and measures we can take that off the table. So take Ukraine to the extent possible out of the geopolitical competition, focus on what other people on this panel have talked about on building up Ukraine, turning it into a competent state with a prosperous economy. And I think we can do that all through a creative diplomacy that will take into account Russia's interest and Russia's vulnerabilities and strengths at this point. But it's not something that's going to happen 3 months from now, 4 months from now. But I think if you gave yourself a year, year and a half, it's certainly doable.
Okay, so we're going to gentleman right there.
Thank you very much. Evgeny Prigerman, the Minsk Dialogue Track 2 Initiative, Belarus. Let me pick on the common neighborhoods. So if we look a little bit beyond Ukraine and broader in this contested area to include other recent partnership countries, What do you think the implications of this unclear relationship between Trump and Putin might be for those countries? And even more importantly, what those countries could possibly do to sort of minimize their own geopolitical vulnerabilities?
Okay, and is there somebody that you want to answer that? So anyone in particular who would like to jump in? Yes, Stefan.
I think do your homework, do your reforms, do the best for your people. I think if you're talking about Belarus, I think that might be a bit more difficult than for countries like Ukraine and Georgia. But anyway, I think that's the main thing you can do. I don't think that you will get much attention from the US president. I think that's an illusion. But I think the EU is still in the neighborhood. There will be an ongoing competition also with Russia. I think that's just a pattern which is going on. But I think the main task is, as some of the countries have started to do it, is doing reforms and doing the best for their people. And developing the economy, do competition, rule of law, all this good governance. Yeah, I think that's the crucial thing.
Mm-hmm. Konstantin.
Yes. I wanted to thank Dmitry, first of all, for his opening remarks, his praise for de-ideologized new American policy, because that kind of just confirmed that the Russian leadership just doesn't have any values. I don't know, the question that is the title of this panel, is Russia trumped? Well, I don't know, I didn't get the answer. But I'm pretty sure that Russia was Putined quite some time ago. And I'm afraid this conversation is going too much into this airless geopolitical debate, while in fact there is no, in my personal view, there is no Russian foreign policy as such. There is Vladimir Putin's foreign policy, which is designed for one specific reason, to keep Vladimir Putin where he is now. And my question to both, to Tom, Stefan, and Mr. Gardner, Ambassador Gardner, is to what extent this proclaimed de-ideologization, lack of intent to interfere in domestic affairs, lack of intent to lecture on human rights and stuff like that, on the part of the current American administration. How does it square with the fact that essentially Russian foreign policy is a direct continuation of Russian domestic policy, and in this respect is probably a high-risk factor, not only for the outside, but for Russia itself? Thank you.
So that's Dima?
No.
Oh, except Dima. Okay, well, good. Let's get somebody else to jump in. Thomas?
You want me to start with
Well,
that?
I guess, because, I mean,
No,
Konstantin,
look,
so-
I disagree with the premise. I don't think Russia's foreign policy is all about Putin and Putin's needs. I think if you look at the policies that are being pursued by Russia at this point, they're active in areas where they've been active historically. And I think you can make, if you're prepared to accept the framework, a good case in a national interest-based foreign policy coming out of the Kremlin. Now, obviously, domestic factors also play a role, but these are domestic factors that have been, I think, persistent in Russia for decades, if not centuries. And that's why I say we've got a Russia problem, not simply a Putin problem. I think it's wrong to assume that if Putin were to disappear overnight, somehow the Russia problem goes away dramatically. I think we would still have problems with a country and a political elite that sees itself as a great power that has to project its influence into, certainly the former Soviet spaces, not more broadly, in order to, in fact, convince itself that it's a great power. That's going to be a challenge for us. It's going to be a Russia that, I think if we're realistic about it, isn't going to adopt anytime soon liberal Western values. It doesn't fit into the European framework cleanly. So, that is going to be a problem as well. This is all a long way of saying that it's, I think we ought to be cognizant of this. I think the United States still should promote its values, and we can do that in various ways. We have historically. It wouldn't be the United States if values weren't a part of our foreign policy. But I think in the current context, some of what the United States has done previously inside Russia has in fact narrowed the space for the type of development we would like to see. So I can see a reason for backing off on things that look like direct interference, but still supporting verbally, rhetorically our values, and also doing things in Russia's immediate neighborhood, particularly in Ukraine, countries that want to move in that direction more to help them move and institutionalize the values that we think are important to prosperity in Europe and in the transatlantic community.
Okay, I want to take like 2 or 3 questions. I think, Molly, you've been patiently waiting there. It's in the second row. And then come over to Mr. Ilyaryonov.
Thank you. And I would also like to thank our Russian colleague for so adequately outlining what I think we're all really slow in acknowledging sometimes, which is that Russia says what they mean. And they say very clearly in their doctrine and their policy, using ideologues that are around the Kremlin, that they view being the disruptor as their main source of power. And I think our other panelists also outline this. They don't want to be at the table as an equal. At this point, they understand that the disruptive power of working with terrorists in the Middle East, working with terrorists in Afghanistan, sorry, it's true, of keeping these types of power gives them the advantage. Why are we so unwilling still to see this? We talked about disinformation and the outsized clout the Kremlin has on this side, but the money that they export to the West is not just about buying yachts, it's buying us. And we're talking about, Russia's never going to accept our values. They're projecting their values onto us. And letting them into the OSCE, letting them into our institutions has corrupted us and our values and our institutions. And why isn't there a comprehensive vision on how we are countering this, and why is there so little leadership from the West, vocally from presidents and otherwise, speaking out against this and providing a clear vision in a time of such turmoil when there is no counter vision to what comes after an unraveling post-World War II world order? Thank you.
Okay, so that's one question. And Mr. Ilyaryonov.
Yes, I have a couple of suggestions, if I may. Since everybody so much likes Dmitry's comments, which I also join, maybe if you would be so kind, maybe you would share your comments in written form with the ICDS. It could be published in Diplomatia, and maybe will be must reading for every Western leader who is looking for any deals with Russia, with the current Russia. Is a big deal or small deal, whatever, just to consult with your very clear statement. That would be extremely helpful. But I would make little suggestions to make a clear distinction between Russia and current administration in Russia. It's a little difference, but it's an important difference.
And the question is?
And the second suggestions based on unique consensus looks like is forming right now in front of our eyes. Consensus about Minsk agreement. Both sides, for the first time, both the Russian side or Western side, agreed that Minsk agreement is not implementable. So we were talking about this for all these 2 years since it has been signed originally. Now it's clear understanding it's not implementable. So I understand why Dmitry, on behalf of the Russian position, is saying that it's not implementable, but we would like to have it. I don't understand why the Western side is following the same way. Why, let's say, Western Ukrainian side say, okay, Minsk agreement is not implementable, let's try to find something else. For example, not Minsk basis, but let's Budapest basis. Why not to try this one? Certainly, it would take probably some time for the current Kremlin side to come with the term that actually it's been signed by Russia back in 93, 94. So, but why West could not do it right now?
Okay, Tony, could you jump in maybe on this question? We also had Molly's question about, the, let's say, the malign influence of corruption and values coming supposedly from Russia. So Tony, let's start with you. if you have some thoughts about
Well,
either of those questions.
Yeah, very briefly, there's a lot of discussion about de-ideologization, or whatever the word is.
Right.
That makes me very uncomfortable, because if we mean by that somehow not promoting human rights, not promoting good governance, transparency, courts that function, I'm not in favor of de-ideologization. I want more ideology. And we should not be timid about promoting those values, either for ourselves or for our allies. I think part of the issue here is that the social contract, I think, in Russia has changed. It used to be buying passivity for economic growth. And that model has probably now collapsed because of oil prices. And now the social contract is we buy passivity by returning to a model of a Russia under siege. And we are the Russia that will defend you against all the threats, mostly imagined, mythical threats of a West that is trying to undermine Russia's role in the world. And that, if that is correct, it means that we have very little scope here, actually, to do anything that will change the minds and the convictions of those who are running the country. So I guess my main point here is that I'm actually in favor, perhaps, of continuing our ideology. Perhaps not regime change, but certainly promoting our values.
Anybody else want to jump in, or can we go to other? Stefan.
I want to respond to your question on why we don't take this challenge more serious and really do the things which are necessary. I think we are afraid of the consequences. I think if we go through the whole thing, I think it will cost us a lot of. Yeah, and in terms of fighting corruption, where we all have benefits in Western Europe, in the US, I think we know where the sources are. We know how it works, but we don't do anything against it because there are people who benefit of it. And if we think about Ukraine, I think it needs a completely different investment into Ukraine to be serious about stabilizing this country. It needs also a much stronger conditionality, but I think we need to explain to our own societies that we have to invest maybe in this country, that we have really a serious challenge, also a security challenge with Russia. Yeah, and I think nobody wants to do this. I think people are really afraid of it. And I think we are also not confident about ourselves. So where are we and where are we standing? Where are the transatlantic relations at the moment? What does the European Union mean, and where it will heading? I think and this is something what Mr. Putin is exploring. Yeah, but I think it's also about ourselves and how we tackle with our own problems. And I think then it makes it even more difficult to take this challenge serious. And I want just shortly respond to why the Western or the Europeans still stick to Minsk. I think the answer is, the German answer would be, there's no alternative to this. We all agree that this is in a stalemate. I was saying from the beginning we need a plan B because it will not work. Yeah, but yeah, let's do it. Let's do it maybe with Budapest. But I don't think that Mr. Putin has an interest to change the deal, because a better deal he will not get. Yeah, and we don't. On one hand, we don't improve our bargaining position, yeah, in taking other measures, nor are we in a situation to change maybe, to bring flexibility in. So I think we just stick to it because we neither move in the one or the other direction. So.
Can I jump in here?
Yes,
because I want to touch the earlier question about corruption, RT, and so forth, and sort of make the broad point. The Russians didn't invent corruption. They didn't invent fake news. A lot of these problems we have here are endemic to our society for various reasons. The American political system has become mildly corrupt over the years. The Russians didn't do that. We did it to ourselves. Fake news is something that has developed because of modern communications technology. It's used repeatedly in the West. The Russians exploit that, and they play on our vulnerabilities, and that is a threat to us. But I think it's a mistake to say that we should only undertake these reforms inside our own countries because of some Russian threat. We ought to be doing this regardless of what the Russians are doing, because it's good for us and it's the right thing to do. The second thing on RT, I hear about RT all the time. How much influence does RT have?
A lot. A lot.
In the United States and in Europe at this point, then that is a real statement about the quality of the news that we provide to our own people. And again, that's not a problem that the Russians have created. It's a problem that we've created for ourselves because we've turned news into entertainment as opposed to serious discussion of issues here. You know, what we used to say in the Cold War is that the response to Russian disinformation was the truth. Now we talk about counter-narratives, that we've got to invent something in order to deal with this, as opposed to what I think is the best response we can give to the challenge from Russia. This is reforming our own societies, living up to our own standards, educating our public about how to look critically at information sources. And in this way, we, in a sense, narrow the field in which Russia can play. That would be the best thing that we could do going forward.
We always come back to this question. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes to go. Could we go 1, 2, 3, very quick answers, and then we'll go to James.
Yes. I'm Colonel Ivar Jaski from NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence. I want to support Ambassador about statement of Stratcom. Yes, we are in Western world very bad conducting Stratcom, and I want to say also that US being absent from our center, missing all the fun what we have in Riga. So about Stratcom, the main strategic communicators are the key leaders, and as we heard, sometimes they are predictable. So I have very simple question to Mr. Suslov that maybe, or what will happen 2024? Is it, can it possible that Putin will hand over his tour and elect successor, or maybe even it can happen 2018? Thank you.
Okay. All right, well, let's start here, please. Okay. Please.
Yeah. Thank you. Kadri Leek, ECFR. A question to Dmitry and maybe also the rest of the panel. I think Dmitry actually outlined very clearly Moscow's thinking about Ukraine and Eastern neighborhood. I mean, that's the real thinking. And we need to take it seriously as such. But my question to Dmitry is there anything that could make it change? I mean, Moscow's attitude towards small neighboring states between Moscow and Europe, so that Moscow would see them as sort of legitimate masters of their own fate rather than objects to be managed by great powers or co-managed by great powers. What would cause that change in Moscow's outlook, if anything? And as long as that is not the case, how should we go about it? Because that's where we clearly clash in Western worldview and Moscow's worldview, and we've clashed repeatedly. And as much as I think about it, I don't see a good solution. I don't think co-managing will work in ways that Moscow imagines. I don't think even freezing it is possible so that it would be fruitful. So what to do?
Okay, and the third question, so Dmitry, you're getting a couple there. Yes. But we'll have to keep it brief because we have 8 minutes and 16 seconds.
A word about nuclear weapons. We are on the threshold of a new nuclear weapon crisis, in the sense that both the US and in particular Russia are increasing their nuclear capabilities. The 2003 agreement with Ukraine showed that to give assurances if you give up your nuclear weapons is of no value. And that certainly is going to make it even more difficult to apply the NTP treaty. My question is really, do you think that the experience we have through the non-implementation of the Budapest Treaty will hamper in the future negotiations on nuclear weapons?
Okay, well, who would like to take that? If we start with the last question, Who would like to take that? Thomas?
I'll give a short answer to it.
Okay.
We're trying to honor the guarantee of the Budapest Memorandum now. That's why we've supported Ukraine in all of this. The idea that the United States should have sent military force or other drastic measures in order to do it, I think is just unrealistic at this point. So the question is whether we remain committed to the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity or not, and whether we're capable of putting in place policies that over time will do that. You know, with the Baltics, we had a policy of non-recognition that we maintained for 40 or 50 years. I don't think that's necessarily what we're going to have to do with Ukraine. But the idea that you can only honor your commitments if you do something drastic and radical at the time the infringement is committed, I think is mistaken, misguided, and leads to bad policy. The question is, how can we get what we want over time in a way that does as little damage as possible to our interest, to the people of Ukraine, and so forth. So I think we are trying to honor it. We don't speak it in those terms, but the restoration of the territorial integrity of Ukraine is a principled position of both the United States and our European allies.
And Zima?
Thank you very much for your questions. Let me also just very briefly comment on the letter. Yes, I think Russia's violation of the Budapest Memorandum is destabilizing for the future of proliferation, but you have to keep in mind two things. First, Ukraine, together with Belarus and Kazakhstan, promised to get rid of their nuclear weapons not in 1994 in Budapest, but in 1992 in Lisbon. Right? And they joined the NPT treaty as non-nuclear powers in May 1992 in Lisbon, with a huge contribution of the Bush senior administration and James Baker in particular. Whereas the Budapest Agreement in 1994 was an additional measure, I mean, yes, to limit Russia's behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine, but it's not the agreement when Ukraine promised to be non-nuclear, it's before. Secondly, yes, as I said, it's destabilizing, but it is, I think, less destabilizing than the effects of attacking Libya. I think the fate of Muammar Gaddafi, who really got rid of his weapons of mass destruction program, but he was then assassinated, torn into pieces and so on and so forth, is much more devastating. And if you compare the US policy towards Iraq, the Bush administration policy, and the current Trump administration policy towards North Korea, where I do not think that any kind of use of force will take place, and ultimately the US, I think, will live with a nuclear-armed North Korea, but with a controlled and limited Korean nuclear and missile program. This is much, much more devastating for the face of the non-proliferation regime. Now the questions about Russia. Well, I think in 2018 Putin will go for re-election. As for 2024, I mean, I don't know, and I don't think that anyone knows. I don't think Putin will decide to stay, and I also think it's unlikely that he will change the Russian constitution and become some kind of chancellor, transforming Russia into a parliamentary republic or so. I think the successor will be found, and in 2024 it will be a real successor rather than the temporary keeper of the throne as Dmitry Medvedev was. But also let me say this. I do not think that after 2024 Russian foreign policy will change fundamentally. And here I agree much more with Tom Graham than with Igor Larionov. I do not think that... oh, excuse me. Andrei, of course. I do not think that Putin's factor on Russian foreign policy on fundamentals is that strong. And I see a clear continuity of Russian foreign policy since middle of 1990s. What changed is the external environment, the distribution of power in the world and other structural things, but not the philosophy of Russia's foreign policy.
Dima, we have one last question because we just have a couple of minutes, I'm sorry. James.
Thank you very much. I will, for the first time, make myself unpopular with this audience. I will, I trust, defend the values that Anthony Gardner spoke about as fervently as he does. But I am sorry, we must acknowledge that the reality and the record of promoting these values in Russia, particularly since 1991, has aroused confusion, resentment, and contempt. The fundamental issues between us are differences of security interests and the culture of security, which has a long legacy and gestation. My modest suggestion is, had we from the beginning adopted the position that Russia's internal affairs are Russia's business, but Ukraine's internal affairs are not Russia's business, we would still have a difficult relationship, but we would be in a far better place than we are today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, James. We have literally a minute. Can anybody say 30 seconds or 25 seconds or something? Because we do, dinner awaits, but very quickly.
Right, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we didn't think we were going to need Russia experts.
And here they are.
The good news is we're going to need Russia experts for some time going forward.
Well, on that, what better note could we end on? But thank you very much, our panel. Dima, Thomas, Stefan, and Tony.